Hey y'all, we're going to do period 3. This unit we are probably going to be focusing on the LEQ. And what we will be looking at is what are the causes of the American Revolution and what are the effects of the American Revolution up until like 1800. So keep an eye for that. Come on. Alright, so what we are looking at today is the context and causes of the revolution. This is our first lecture. So I think all of these things are context. So we are looking at the causes of the American Revolution. We are looking at what was it like before the American Revolution. So I think that one of the things to think about is that before the American Revolution, it is a very diverse place. We talked about this before. We have immigrants coming from all over Europe and Africa. So we have enslavement, we have immigration, and the colonists are doubling in numbers nearly every 25 years. So the other part about the United States is that we are massively increasing our amount of people. I think I read somewhere that in the beginning it was about a 20-to-1 ratio of English folks to colonists, and by the time we get up towards the Revolution, it's like a 3-to-1 ratio. So again, immigration, increase in population, and enslavement is causing a massive increase in people. So while the colonies were English, they were diverse, and they had people who migrated from all over Europe and were enslaved from Africa, right? So the other part is mercantilism. This should be a review. The point of mercantilism is that the colony is subjugated to the mother country. Luxury goods and status things come from England. So I'd buy my tea set from England. I would buy my silk from England. I would buy my tea from England, right? All of these manufactured goods, even nails, windows, all of these things are coming from England. The role of the colony is to support the mother country. They're supposed to pay their taxes. They're supposed to supply them with raw materials, right? And so this is what they are supposed to be doing. And again, the navigation acts are regulating trade. I think most folks kind of got that before. So if we looked at it, these are supposed to be sending raw materials, fur, fish, tobacco, lumber. They are sending back manufactured goods. And in the triangular trade, we have slaves coming from Africa and all that. So what we also looked at is while mercantilism is the law of the land, you're supposed to be paying your taxes on all those things that are coming in. You are not supposed to be, trading with other countries. One of the things, if you look down in the Caribbean, is you have like Dutch colonies down there. And so Boston has its own trade where they take their cod that they are fishing to, say, a Dutch colony. They smuggle into New England the sugar from these Dutch colonies. They do not pay their taxes, right? And then they make it into rum, and then they're going over to Africa and getting slaves and then coming back, right? So, New England is using their fishing industry, they are using their shipbuilding industry, they are using their merchants, and they are smuggling in massive amounts. Now, the South is probably not smuggling as much because what they're doing is they're sending their tobacco to England. So that is that. So, we talked about that last time, and this idea of, this idea of there is mercantilism on the law. We have the navigation acts on the books, but what is in fact happening is called salutary neglect. So while we have these laws on the books, England is looking the other way. Salutary neglect is probably the biggest concept to remember for this whole unit, because as people are smuggling their Dutch sugar, as people are doing all of this, the English are like, well, let them do it. They're pretty lenient. Since we talk about a mother country, it is actually easy to think about a parent. Salutary neglect is like nice neglect. So not a parent that beats their child or starves their child. That's not what England is doing. The colonies are actually doing really, really well. So it is not a harmful neglect, but it is a leniency. It is a kind of like, they're just not interfering with the colonies. So salutary neglect is like a nice neglect. It is like a lenient mother. Yes, there's rules on the book. Yes, you are supposed to like have a curfew, but if you are generally doing well in school and, whatever, I'm not going to come down too hard on you. So, it's like we have these rules, but a lenient parent who doesn't really enforce them and lets their kid basically do what they want as long as they seem like they're staying in line. So, salutary neglect is a nice neglect, and England is the one doing it. So, while mercantilism was the law of the land, English engaged in salutary neglect and did not strictly enforce it. I think that is probably the biggest thing to remember for before the American Revolution. Alright, here is a bunch of stuff that, we probably, I don't know what happened there. Anyway, Henry VIII, actually, I don't know what happened on the slide. Anyway, Henry VIII started the Church of England. He's Protestant. Then we have Bloody Mary, and she's Catholic. And then we have another Protestant, Elizabeth, who's the Virgin Queen. She's the one who goes to war with the Spanish, and Hakluyt loves her and, convinced her to do the colonization with Queen Elizabeth, and that's why it's called Virginia after the Virgin Queen. Then we have James, who's a Protestant, who the Catholics try to blow up in the gunpowder plot with, Guy Fawkes. Then we have the English Civil War, where Charles is basically defending his divine right against the Puritans, which is essentially why the Puritans were leaving in the 1630s, because Charles was starting to kind of, crack down on them. Then the Puritans get into power with Cromwell, and they kill Charles for treason. So where are we? Now the Puritans have power. So you're actually not going to have as many Puritans coming over because they won. Oh, but then Charles II is going to come in, and this is called the Great the Restoration, where we get the Charleses back in. A bunch of bad things happen during that time. Then we're going to get a Catholic. Then we're going to have the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary, and that's when we're going to do William and Mary University. Okay. What is my point? Do we care about this? No, right? This is not European history. This is not English history. It would probably benefit to remember some of that stuff, but, one thing to look at is that the colonies are being settled all during this time, and people are fleeing at different times for different reasons. So at some point, the Catholics might be leaving, and then the Puritans are leaving, and then people might be leaving from, bad conditions, from, the plague or the fire from London. So even the English people who are leaving leave at different times for different reasons. The other part of the English kind of politics is that they do not have a written constitution. They have, in theory, right, 3 branches of government. Most of it, all of it is controlled by the aristocracy. And in England, law is a tradition that is not formally written. Okay. So why does all that matter? Is that, by the time we get to the Revolution, we're going to have the Mad King George, and by the time we get there, England has been through a lot, and by the time we get to the Glorious Revolution, the Parliament actually has a lot of control. So we tend to think, especially when we get to the Declaration, because they're saying the king is the one who's doing all things, but really, Parliament is the one who is in control. They are the one who has legislative power. They are the one who is in control of taxation. The king is kind of like the symbolic head of the state, and people still pledge loyalty to him, and he controls a lot of the bureaucracy as far as appointments. But, in reality, it's Parliament that has most of the power. And the reason why that's important is because we're going to talk about representation. So Parliament is the one who is making these laws. They're making these taxes. So when we get to no taxation without representation, the reason why it matters is because Parliament is the one who is doing it. So as far as that goes, it was only virtual representation as far as the colonists in Parliament, which means they did not have representation. They were basically just not included. And this virtual representation is this idea that the head is never going to do anything that the arms don't want, and you should just believe that we're making the best decisions for you. So that is their kind of position in the Parliament, which is they do not have representation. But in the colony, within the colony, let's say Virginia, each colony had its own representative government, and they had a British royal governor, which was at the head. So this is very much like what it was like in England, but on a local level, where you had the royal governors and the representative government. But the representative government was really what did almost everything. And I think the difference is in the colonies, they had a written constitution. So while King George II was king, Parliament had most of the control of England, and the colonies were only virtually represented. The colonies had a large degree of independence with a representative governments and a royal governor from the king. So everything was cool, as long as they had their independence, the representative governments, their constitutions that they wrote. They had salutary neglect, and they were basically left alone. The last part is about established churches and the First Great Awakening. So established churches are these churches that come over from England. They are tax-supported churches. The biggest two are the Congregational, what we know as the Puritans, and the Anglican. So each colony had a, like this is our religion. So like Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and part of New York were Anglican. They were loyal to the Church of England, and a College of William and Mary was built to kind of support the Anglican Church. And then you have the Congregational Church. They made Harvard for their ministers, and this is the Puritan Church. And so in New England, except for Rhode Island, they have an established church of the Puritan or Congregational Church. Now, this is going to be challenged by the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening shakes things up, and it challenges those established religions. So these new lights are going to encourage independence of thought, less dependence on established churches. They're going to encourage missionary work and equality. These new light universities are going to come up. These are Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. It's the first mass movement of the American people. You can think of this as like popular culture. People are identifying, they have like a common reference point up and down America, a sense of identity, and a sense of this individualism as far as religion. The other thing that is kind of connecting the colonies together are coffee houses and newspapers and the Enlightenment. It seems kind of contradictory, but you even get people like Ben Franklin, who is kind of into both in a weird way. Anyway, so newspapers are important to the colonists, and they did have a really independent press. Probably the biggest example is like the Zanger trial. He was a German. He's accused of libel by the governor of New York, but he gets off, and this by a jury. And I think jury is a really big part of this, is because, local folks looked out for local folks. If your friend is brought up against the governor, you're going to side with your friend, and so juries a lot of times would let people off. So they had a pretty independent press, and people would go to these coffee houses, they would read newspapers, they're reading Enlightenment thinkers, and they're all kind of like coming up with these ideas. Side note, a lot of people believe that like tea and coffee is important for the Enlightenment because before this, everyone got drunk on beer and people were not as enlightened. Side note. All right, so the colonists were developing ideas coming. So we have ideas like the Great Awakening. These preachers came from Europe and the Enlightenment, but what they're doing is they're creating and using it to form a new American identity. So the Americans are doing that. So that is the background. Before we get to the revolution, and let's take a look. Most folks take the revolution to start to talk about the beginning of the revolution with the end of the French and Indian War. So before the French and Indian War, the English colonies were threatened by the French. They were also threatened by the Dutch. They're threatened by Native Americans as we're pressing out into their land. And so the Albany Plan of Union was proposed by Benjamin Franklin, and what he originally said in 1754 is join or die in the Albany Plan of Union against the French and against the Native Americans. Join in this union of common defense so that we can beat any enemy. Now, I think what's important about this is it fails. It does not work. But this is considered the first political cartoon. And originally it was join or die with the British against the French. So the French and Indian War is primarily over in America over the Ohio River Valley. Essentially, the colonists wanted to go into and beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and they're coming up against the French. They're coming into Native American land, and they basically want to clear that out. Now, it is not all Indians and the French against the English. Some Native Americans do support the British, including the Iroquois Confederacy and the Cherokee, but most Native Americans are going to side with the French. We have not looked at the French extensively, but the French mostly traded with the Native Americans. They did not have a lot of people in the colonies, so they are kind of a better bet for Native Americans. So in this, I just wanted to show this. This is the disputed land that the colonists are fighting over, right, is right here. This is the land, right? These are the English colonists right here, and they want to take this over. Now, this is the French, and they're clashing in this disputed land, all right? So that is the Ohio River Valley, and in North America, this is what the conflict is over. But what I also want to say is this is also the 7 Years' War. And in the 7 Years' War, it is basically the First World War. We obviously don't call it that. But the 13 American colonies are actually the least profitable colonies. It is probably economically England could care, I don't know, not that they could care less about it, but they could kind of, I don't know. They're more focused on the sugar colonies, the tea trade, the transatlantic slave trade. These are the areas of money that they want. So William Pitt, though, who is in England, decides when he looks at this map, he's like, where will we go where we are going to win? And what he decides is that this is the best place that the British are going to win. One, we've already talked about it. They have a huge numbers of people in North America. The numbers are huge, right? They are basically competing with England as far as numbers. The French, they have very few folks. The other thing is the geography. The French would essentially come in here and use these rivers and come down to the Mississippi, right? They controlled these waters. Now, when the English take a look at this land, they're like, the one place we know we can win is in North America. Because if you cut that off, if you cut off Quebec, the French are done. So Pitt takes a look at the world map. He's like, what I really want is, Africa and India and, Asia and these sugar colonies that are here. But where we are going to fight, where we are going to focus is in North America. So really the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War are about these kind of big mercantilist power plays between England and France. But it comes out in the French and Indian War. Now, England is going to win, but the British are going to not be able to control the Indians after they sign a treaty. So I'm going to start with, in 1763, the French and Indian War ends, right? The English are going to win, and they are going to sign a treaty. Now, on that treaty, the French are essentially going to leave North America. They're gone, right? So if we take a look at this map, while the French are gone out of this land, who is still here? And I love this map because they don't even mention them in the French and Indian War. Oh, look, the French are gone. Who are still there? Are the Indians, right? Who did not sign the Treaty of Paris? The Indians. And so what's going to happen is after the French leave, in the French and Indian War, the Indians are essentially going to continue fighting. And when they continue fighting, this is called Pontiac's War, and it just kind of continues and rolls into past the thing. And so Amerindians are going to resist British control. They don't like the British because the British are not fair to them. They violate their treaties. They get attacked by the frontiersmen. One of them is this Paxton boys, who basically, when the English come into their lands, they just burn down anyone that they think is Native American. They don't care if there's an alliance. And so Pontiac Wars continues against the English. And the English do not care about the Ohio River Valley. So what the English do is they create what is called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And they are like, okay, colonists, we are going to draw a line here. And you are going to stay on this line. And this is going to be the Indian land, right? So this Proclamation Line is important because what did the colonists fight for? Well, the colonists wanted land in the Ohio River Valley. This is the Ohio River, right? They wanted this land. This is what the colonists were fighting for. Why didn't the English keep fighting so that the colonists could get that land? Because England doesn't care about the Ohio River Valley. They wanted world domination. And so they're willing to sign a treaty with the Native Americans. And they're just like, all right, colonists, stay on this side. Now, are the colonists going to listen? No. Do the colonists ever listen? No. Okay, so we could think about that Proclamation Line of 1763. So, like, although the colonists were fighting for the Ohio River Valley and England won the French and Indian War, the colonists were denied access to these lands because of the Proclamation Line. Oh, this should be 1763. I need to edit this. All right, I'm going to edit it. All right. So salutary neglect we went through before, and people kind of felt like this was why the colonies were doing well. It was because we left them alone, right? So they had relatively little taxation. They were doing their smuggling, a very little light tax burden. England was just basically do what you wanna, right? So Pitt goes and he fights the war. He goes into debt, and he decides that we need to start getting more money from the colonists. Now, what is the policy here is actually kind of odd. It seems counterintuitive, but what they actually start doing is reducing taxes, collecting more, and increasing enforcement. Then they also start putting things in royal, not local control, meaning that, like, if you get caught smuggling, you're not going to go in front of your friends. You're going to go in front of, like, a royal court. So why would you reduce taxes in order to get more money? And I think the best example is, I don't know, today might be like a cigarette tax. If Louisiana put a $10 tax on cigarettes, and let's say today we sold 1 million packs of cigarettes, we would not make $10 million on a cigarette tax because people are not going to buy cigarettes. They're going to avoid paying the tax by quitting, or they're going to smuggle them from, like, Mississippi. So, like, entrepreneurial people will go to Mississippi, pack up their trunk full of cigarettes, come into, like, a gas station and sell their cigarettes out of their trunk for, say, like a $5 mock-up. That is smuggling. And so people were avoiding paying the large taxes, and the smugglers were making money. So now if I reduce the tax to, say, $3, the smugglers don't make as much money, and more people will actually pay the tax. Okay, so what they're going to do is actually reduce most of the taxes, collect it more, and they're going to enforce it more. So the debt is really the issue here. The first time they try to collect more money is the Sugar Act, which they reduce the cost of this tax. And the thing is, people are starting to get mad. And I think this is always a funny quote, because they say the right of Parliament to charge foreign molasses with a duty of a sixpence was unquestionable, but for Parliament to reduce it to 3 pence is unconstitutional. So they find it weird because they're reducing taxes and people are starting to get mad. But it works. They do start to get more taxes collected. During salutary neglect, they go from like $2,000 to £30,000. But there's also an increased troop presence, which we'll get into that later. So Parliament was supreme. Virtual representation, we went over that before. This idea that, like, they got it covered, don't worry about it. And when things really get off is when they make a Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was basically a tax on any piece of paper, right? Anything that's written, anything that's printed, anything that is a register, any degree from a university, anything from learning, any newspaper, any pamphlet, any public news. People did not like the Stamp Act for multiple reasons. One is it's a direct tax. This is not a tax on imports or exports like our mercantilist policies as they were before. It is a tax on what people are doing within the colonies. This is a tax on people's interactions with each other. This is an internal tax. So people thought that was like off limits for the Parliament to tax internal colonial affairs. The other thing is they saw it as a tax on, like, knowledge and freedom of speech, and they start to rebel against it with this idea of no taxation without representation. That since Americans can't be in Parliament, they need to resist this. So The Stamp Act in 1765 is really the beginning of the troubles for England because people start basically rioting over this Stamp Act. Because it's a stamp on knowledge, because it was seen as an internal tax, the Sons of Liberty are going to organize and they are going to resist this thing. So basically, this is that little like part on the top. You know, every newspaper is going to have, it's supposed to have a stamp on it. Well, what are they going to do? They just refuse to cooperate. So they're like, this is where you should put the stamp. This like skull and crossbone, right? This is what you can do with your stinking stamp, right? Go ahead, try to arrest me. We're not paying our tax. And so, you know, you start to see resistance just in like refusal to cooperate. Probably what people say was the most effective form of resistance was the boycott. So you have to imagine in this mercantilist policy, the colonists are supposed to be good colonists and take and buy their teapots. They're supposed to buy their tea. They're supposed to buy all these nice little things from England so that England can make her money. Now, one of the things that especially women are going to do, or the Daughters of Liberty, is they are not going to be the people usually out in the streets like hanging people in effigy. But what they do is they stay home, they make cloth. They are the ones who are purchasing things. These are the people who are drinking tea. These are the people who are promising not to make or buy British-made cloth or tea or anything else. So these women are the ones who are kind of pushing forward these boycotts and not buying anything from England. These spinning clubs become like patriotic events, and you know, if you look at American fashion, it's considered to be, you know, patriotic, to have kind of American simplicity. We are not trying to be this nobility from England. And so the Sons of Liberty are kind of known for more radical organized resistance. These are riots. Some people would maybe even call it terrorism, where they start to attack property of, one of their rules was it's okay to destroy public property. It's not okay to kill people. Private property should be avoided. And so, you know, what would these Sons of Liberty do? Well, they can't make us pay a tax if we burn down the office, right? They can't make us pay a tax if we burn down the collections, you know, like these places. So when they did destroy property, it was often these kind of royal offices. The other thing is that they would also do things like hang people in effigy. So they might not destroy somebody's home. That was usually tried to be avoided. But when he walked out of his house, he would see someone hanging in a tree and it would say, "This is you." And the thing is, people are kind of doing all of these weird things and rioting and you know, resisting and destroying property. And they're writing to each other in these committees of correspondence, talking about what is working and what is not. You have to imagine at this time, there is no police. Essentially, the way laws would be enforced is just by communities coming together to enforce these laws. The only way the crown could enforce any of these laws is to send in more of the army, which is kind of hard because they want these taxes to be paid to pay for the army, but they need more of the army to get the taxes because nobody is following the law. So, you know, you basically, in order to enforce laws, you have to have the support of the community. It is impossible to enforce these laws unless you just kill people without the support of the community. And the crown has lost support by the community. One of the more extreme actions that people would do is called tarring and feathering. This would happen in New England. People would have tar because it would be used to make boats, and usually a lot of these interactions happened on the docks. This is essentially British officials and snitches get tarred and feathered. It is burning hot tar put on your body. Usually it would tear off your skin when it came off. I don't know of anyone who got killed this way, but it is definitely torture. So I think, you know, these guys are seen as like vigilantes, as terrorists, as patriots. You know, what would you call them, as they are, you know, destroying property, tarring and feathering people, hanging people in effigy, and generally being rowdy. All right. Other forms of resistance is more like petitioning. This is actually an example people believe is made by Franklin. When he went to England, he is essentially petitioning Parliament to kind of listen to the colonies. And this cartoon is his, and he's basically saying, look, this is England, her colonies reduced. This is you when you lose all of your limbs, when you lose New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. If you are hurting your own body by having this Stamp Act. Okay, what happens to the Stamp Act? Oh, also, Franklin's original cartoon gets kind of co-opted. So, this is Franklin's idea of how to petition, and other people take his original cartoon and they use it as a rallying cry to join or die against the Stamp Act, against the British. So his original cartoon, which was to get people to join or die with the British, is now being used to go against it. So it's changing meaning over time. So the Stamp Act is repealed. All these things are successful. It's hard to say which one worked most. Most people believe it was the boycotts. But, in 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. And I always think it's funny because I think today we talk about like virtue signaling. The English definitely did that because after the Stamp Act was repealed, the British tried to sell Americans kind of like their tea sets, but now their tea sets are stamped with like, look at what you did. Now there's no Stamp Act. You can buy my teapot now. So like English merchants were virtue signaling to like the British or to the colonists to say like, hey, you can buy our cool teapot. Anyway, so things settled down for the most part for a couple of years. But you still have the Sons of Liberty. They're still kind of all up in arms but you do have this kind of growing army presence and military, and where they are kind of becoming into more conflict is in Boston. The Boston Massacre is probably, most folks would not call it a massacre. It's 5 civilians who died. Mobs of civilians surrounded soldiers in protest, and in the confusion, the soldiers fired, and 5 civilians died. The thing is, they were throwing insults and snowballs at the British Guard. More soldiers are going to arrive, so it's kind of this like rowdy crowd, and you have the British soldiers, and someone throws a snowball, and then 5 people die. Now, if you take a look at, this is Paul Revere's printing of it. It is, the British standing there firing straight up into the crowd. It doesn't show them with any weapons or clubs or snowballs or anything. These British soldiers, actually, John Adams is going to be the lawyer for them, and he gets them, they are actually found innocent of this massacre, it is still keeping these tensions alive with this, with the force of the military trying to enforce laws that the colonists do not want. Things escalate more when we get to the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act, again, is going to reduce the tax on tea, but by doing that, again, they are going to cut out smugglers. So this lower tax was seen as like a back way for the colonists to agree to taxation without representation, and people, again, are up in arms. And we kind of know how that goes. Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea shipped by the port of East India Company is now in the harbor. The destruction of manly opposition to the mechanization of tyranny stares at you in the face. Every friend of this country to himself and posterity is now called this day to make a united and successful resistance to the last, worst, most destructive measure of this administration. They are going to dump this tea into the harbor. This is property damage. This is all of that. So, some of the British were actually sympathetic to the American cause. This is a sympathetic British cartoon that basically shows Parliament raping America, pouring tea down her throat. And they're like, yeah, maybe we're doing the wrong thing. Maybe we should just leave them alone like we did before. So some British, usually like the Whigs, were for the American cause. But, the Crown and other folks are done with America. And they're especially done with Boston. So what they're going to do in 1774 after the Tea Act is they're going to pass the Coercive Act or Intolerable Acts. And this is meant to make Boston pay. They're going to close the Boston port. They are going to increase these admiralty courts rather than American courts. They allow their troops to be quartered in any town in Massachusetts. They reduce the right to self-government. And so they try to crack down on Boston. Now, the first battle of the American Revolution is going to happen also in Massachusetts, in Lexington and Concord. The colonists start to resist against these, actions. And the British hear that there is a store of guns in a town, and they're basically on their way to go get these guns when, they hear the British are coming from Paul Revere. So people are able to cut them off, and then we get the shot heard around the world. And I think this is specifically important that, shots are fired in Lexington and Concord before we ever do the Declaration of Independence. So after Lexington and Concord, people are begging George to stop, but it just doesn't work. And people make the decision to go to independence. One of the thing that is going to be the deciding factor is Thomas Paine's common sense. And people are just basically we are done. This cannot be bound up. And so Jefferson is going to go on to write the Declaration of Independence. And in 1776, it's going to be voted on by Congress and issued on July 4th. These are the words that, ring throughout history. For good or bad, they are what we look to for our inspiration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is social contract theory. This is using the Enlightenment. This is, saying we have the right to abolish it because you are not upholding your end of the contract. In New York, they are going to basically, once they hear the Declaration, they're going to start toppling these, royal statues of, the king. And I want you guys to take a look that, not everyone is into this, especially in New York City. You have a lot of loyalists who are no, right? Not everyone is into this. So the nation is still divided. There are people who believe that we should remain loyal to the king. And then you have patriots who are saying, no, we need to get out of here. And that is where we are going to end. We're going to look at the American Revolution and its effect more in the next speech. Sorry, this went a little long.